There are a lot of weapons in Dead Cells. A lot of them are good and some of them not so good. Today we'll take a look at one of the examples of the latter. The Giant Killer is a survival-only weapon that I definitely consider an outlier among the weapons that either got buffed or reworked throughout the years. Introduced all the way back from the Rise of the Giant DLC, I don't believe this weapon has received a significant change to its playstyle or damage. It's one of the rare cases that its gimmick has not aged well due to the changes that updates have brought, and its incredibly mediocre normal damage and unconditional crit condition makes it one of the most dimensional playstyles and in my opinion, one of the worst weapons in the game at the moment. In this video, I thought that instead of showcasing a weapon, I would hone in and focus solely on a weapon to explore what it does good and bad at, and maybe talk about some possible reworks or buffs that can make it better. Now just a quick disclaimer. When I say it's the worst weapon in the game, I really don't mean that it's completely useless or that there is no way to use it. In fact, I actually used the Giant Killer to clear one of the boss cell levels when I was still learning the game. And of course, that is not to say that this weapon will forever be bad. There's always the chance that it either gets a buff or some updates in the future indirectly makes it better. Alright, let's get started with the analysis. The playstyle of the Giant Killer is as straightforward as it gets. It's got 4 attacks. The first 2 come out rather rapidly. Then the heavy-hitting 3rd and 4th come out with a somewhat long delay. It will crit if the target is an elite or boss enemy. Now let's talk about how you're supposed to use this in the run. Given that the crit condition is unconditional, you can't just somehow crit on an enemy. Its use in a run is very limited. Yes, you can make it so that you wait for an enemy to turn into an elite on 5 BC, but that's really not a good idea. Meaning the only best time where this can be used is to bring it to bosses. However, there's actually a restriction that's exclusive to the Giant Killer. Before you get any smart ideas of just stowing it in your backpack and switching it with your main weapon when you approach a boss fight, the weapon itself cannot be put in the backpack, meaning if you just haul it with you as a dedicated boss-killing weapon, you can't do that. However, during the time when I actually used it, I just saw it in the cavern, I took it, I fought the giant with it, and then I skipped straight to Hand of the King and then got my next boss cell that way. It's a highly conditional weapon that can pop off very hard when given the right circumstances. So let's talk about why its design and gameplay makes it not so good as a weapon. On the surface, we can see that if you crit, the Giant Killer has a base DPS of 465, which I believe is among one of the highest in the game. However, using DPS to gauge how powerful a weapon is can generally be pretty inaccurate, which is why I don't really like showing the DPS of a weapon on the tooltip in the game, as it can be misleading. To demonstrate how this number can be misleading, we're about to get real nerdy in here, but I'm going to talk about the intervals between every attack animation to compare to how much damage they do. When we pull up the time it takes for the beheaded to swing the full combo, it will take 0.45 seconds each for the first 2 attacks, which deals a total of 60 base damage in 0.9 seconds. The majority of the Giant Killer's damage actually comes out from the last 2 attacks, meaning in order to deal over 60 damage, you will have to continue the combo for another 0.6 seconds until the attack connects, or 0.8 for the full 3rd hit to finish. Let's compare this to other survival weapons. Just randomly picking some, we can see that the Wrecking Ball already does 200 base damage from the first attack in 1.1 seconds. With the Gold Digger, even without the crit condition, which by the way is much easier to meet than the Giant Killer, it deals 170 base damage in 1.2 seconds. Let's see how well the Giant Killer does if it does manage to crit. In that case, the damage is quite substantial. In fact, the 3rd and 4th hit has some of the highest attack potential in the game. This is very good in clearing elites and bosses, except they account for a very small portion of the run. And as we talked about in the combo section, most of its damage is reserved for the last 2 hits in the chain. And on top of that, the crit multiplier for the Giant Killer is considerably higher than most other weapons I find. A crit will deal 3.66 times its normal damage. When most other weapons crit, I found the multiplier to only hover around 2 times its normal damage. This means the Giant Killer does much better damage when satisfying the crit condition versus if it doesn't. Which again, elites and bosses, kind of hard to come by in your runs. During the legendary reworks, it's also got a unique legendary affix. The fourth and final attack of the combo deals double critical damage. This is pretty big, assuming that you're fighting an elite or boss and that you make it to the last attack. It can feel immensely satisfying chipping away a large chunk of a boss's health. The drawback is that it deals 2 times critical damage, meaning its usual damage is not boosted at all, and you'll need to land the entire combo, as well as making sure the target is actually alive when you get to it to have any impact. This is definitely one of the most situational legendary effects in the game. Also, remember that unique restriction where you can't put Giant Killer in the backpack? Well, there's actually a very easy way to circumvent that. Sure, you can't put it in your pack, but you can put any other weapon in your pack instead. Just carry the Giant Killer in your main slot, then put your actual main weapon in your backpack. Now you can carry both items throughout the entire run. It seems like a pretty major oversight, but the reason why this restriction seems kinda pointless is because the Giant Killer was added to the game before the backpack update. There used to be a point in time where you couldn't drop the item in your backpack, and the pack itself would only be available if you were carrying a two-handed weapon. The idea at the time is that since players will be using both weapon slots for a single weapon, the backpack was a solution to make transitioning to a new loadout more smoothly, as whatever item in your pack would fill in the second empty slot whenever you ditched your two-handed weapon for something else. This restriction with the Giant Killer already existed back then, and since the backpack updates where you had a lot more freedom, the no backpack rule just became obsolete. But if you ask me, even if you can put it in the backpack, I still wouldn't think it's that busted. I tried doing a run with it, and as you probably saw with the footage in this video, but I overall found it to be very underwhelming in terms of damage if you don't crit. Admittedly, in bosses, it actually feels quite rewarding when landing those big numbers. The only problem is that these moments get greatly outweighed by the majority of biomes where I hit enemies like a wet noodle, sometimes needing to complete the full combo to get rid of a bigger target. Now that we've established all the flaws of the Giant Killer, what are some ways we can improve it? Well, first, I don't think it would be that big of a deal if you were allowed to put it in the backpack. The restriction mainly came when the feature wasn't so fleshed out, and I don't see how it would change much since we can already find a loophole around this mechanic rather easily. Next, a change that I think would be quite interesting is to make the Giant Killer crit on enemies with the Giant trait, aka large enemies like Oven Knights, Ground Shakers, and Golems. They've done something similar with the Crowbar rework, where it now crits on enemies that are considered bestial. Now, I'm not sure if putting traits on enemies can be easily done given the current code of the game, as I couldn't easily find enemies that are considered bestial, and just had to look up which enemies the crowbar was effective against on the wiki. However, just like how certain bosses like Conjunctivius, Mama Tick, and Dracula are now considered bestial, you now have an incentive to route to different biomes over others. It buffs the crowbar weapon in a way where it still tests the player's knowledge of the game to take full advantage of it. If, for example, the Giant Killer crits on giant enemies, you will have to think about which levels have primarily large targets, where biome choices like the Slumbering Sanctuary could get an edge in being selected when running the Giant Killer. Of course, this is just one possible rework that I can think of, but I'm sure there are others out there too. Anyways, that brings us to the end of this analysis video. I hope you enjoyed this closer look of a weapon in Dead Cells. I have a couple more items in mind that I can probably do some of these videos on, so let me know if you're interested in more videos that are the same style as this one. I actually had to look up some internal information about the weapon and actually learned a great portion about the game I've never known about. That being said, try out the Giant Killer for yourself and see if it's as bad as advertised. If there are some other ways to make it work, definitely let myself and others know in the comments. Enjoy the game as always, and I'll see you next time.